Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and today we're talking about the Superman family and specifically the wedding of the 1980s Superboy, formerly known as Lor-Zod, and the 1990s Supergirl, who's also known as the Earthborn Angel of Fire. In our game world, Superboy is one of Superman's kids. But this version of Supergirl was a protoplasmic matrix that was created by Lex Luthor in the late 1980s. And then in the mid 1990s, there was a human girl who had been manipulated by a demon named Buzz into joining a cult where Buzz tried to sacrifice her. And the Matrix Supergirl tried to plug the wound, and they ended up merging. The point there is this second Supergirl wasn't actually related to Superman at all until now, when she became his daughter in law. But before we get into all of that and more, smash like, make sure you're subscribed, and as always, leave us a comment. That helps us out on our end with the YouTube algorithm, but also we love hearing from you guys. We've got an awesome community here, and it's all thanks to you. So thank you so much for being here. So, with all that said, let's dive in. The story to this one seems pretty simple. The 80s Superboy marries the 90s Supergirl. And not too long after this, Infinite Crisis happens, which, by the way, was the moment I quit reading comic books. I hated that they killed the original Superman. And a lot of the stories that both DC and Marvel told after this, I hated. In fact, I started to hate a lot of the then current superheroes, and it was one of the many reasons why we played a supervillain campaign. But I'm getting ahead of myself. After a while, I looked at the state of comics. A lot of old readers, like the guys who had been the customers at my comic book store that I owned, also quit reading comics around that time. The genre started to feel darker to a lot of us, and it all seemed to start with Infinite Crisis. Marvel's Secret Invasion wasn't great either, with heroes ripping Skrulls apart with their bare hands as if they were a zombie horde. Also, around that same general ballpark of time, my childhood hero, Christopher Reeve, sadly passed away. So in our game, we ignored the publishing dates of the comics, just as we were going to start ignoring a lot of things that the comics were doing. And we said that Infinite Crisis did happen, and our Superman, the Golden Age Superman, did die during that event. But his date of death would line up with the date that Christopher Reeve passed away. In the 1980s Superboy, who was created by the guy who made the 1980s Superman movies and who he named after Reeve himself, that Superboy now had to take over as Superman. Talk about having big shoes to fill. And for us, it was the perfect story arc. As a kid, he wanted to be like Superman. And we have several adventures posted here on the channel that go into that in great detail. But point being, making him Superman brought the whole game full circle. And it meant the Earthborn Angel of Fire was going to become the new Superwoman. And in many ways, they were the first family, at least as far as our game world went. Soon, she would give birth to a little boy. And a couple years later, they'd have a daughter, too. And over time, those two characters would be the next Superboy and Supergirl, which we liked. So, when we talk about the day that they got married, I thought maybe I should put it in perspective that this is the day Superman married Superwoman. And it's the dawn of a new era, a brighter era. Right now, we're talking about the dark age of our game, and it's going to be over pretty soon. If you take a step back and look at the 1930s, that was the golden age in our world, and it had a certain vibe. More than anything, it established things. Then the 1950s was the Silver Age, and on the surface, it seemed very happy go lucky. That would have certainly been a lot of people's takeaway back then. Then you get to the 1970s, which for us is the Bronze Age, and it wasn't as squeaky clean as the 50s. And in my humble opinion, it was actually peak comics. That was the era of the Amazing Spider-Man and the Legion of Doom, etc. But then you get to the 90s and things start to get grim and gritty. Gone in our game world are the fun crossovers of the 80s with characters like He-Man, Lion-O, and Optimus Prime. Instead, the 90s was all about Image Comics and the characters from there who were either kill happy or porn stars for the most part, with very few characters in between the two. And the 90s gave us the Eradicator Superman, the Azrael Batman, and the Artemis Wonder Woman, who were all more extreme than their predecessors. And after the turn of the century, as previously mentioned, we'd been running a villain campaign, partially caused by the arrival of the Lochnar, which was the embodiment of evil itself. So the wedding of Superboy and Supergirl is a ray of hope amidst all this darkness. And I hope it's received that way. Things are about to turn around. They just haven't quite yet. So that said, the original Superman, aka Clark Kent Sr., is here at the wedding, as is his wife, Lois, as are a bunch of their daughters who are Supergirl's bridesmaids. And honestly, I could end the video here, but that would be kind of short. And since my own players often have questions about Superman's kids, I've decided to list the survivors here, leaving out characters like the half-human Clark Kent Jr., who was our post-crisis Superman, who died fighting Doomsday about 10 years prior to this. So, first kid I will mention is Lily Kent. Her first appearance was Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane, number 15, from February of 1960. Next is Carol Kent, whose first appearance was Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane, number 23, February 1961. She appeared again, by the way, in Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane, number 36, in October of 1962. Next is Lola Kent, aka Supermaid, whose first appearance was Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, number 56, from October of 1961. Next up is Lisa, aka Superlass, whose first appearance was Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane, number 91, April 1969. Next is Laney, whose first appearance was Superman number 215 from April of 1969. Then we get Laura Kent, whose first appearance was Superman Family number 200 from April of 1980. Then we get Martha Kent, whose first appearance was Superman, the Man of Tomorrow number 15 from 1999. Then Laura, whose first appearance was The Dark Knight Strikes Again, then again in Adventures of Superman number 638, and then yet again in Injustice, Gods Among Us, year 3, number 7. Then there's Jane Kent, whose first appearance was Superman's Secret Identity. And last but not least, zor-el, who in the comics, as I understand it, is not a daughter in the traditional sense, but rather she was created by Brainiac using the DNA of Lois and Clark. Anyways, in our game, she is a daughter in the traditional sense, and her first appearance was Superman, the 10-Cent Adventure, number 1. So, Lily, Carol, Lola, Lisa, Laney, Laura, Martha, Lara, Jane, and zor-el are the 10 bridesmaids. And like I said, this era of the game is what we players refer to as the Dark Age of comics. And at this point, it's a supervillain campaign. And as such, all the bridesmaids are actually in the harem of John Redbridge, and most of them are in varying states of pregnancy, which is a huge deal for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is because John Redbridge used to be Superman Red, the old crime-fighting partner of Superman Blue, aka Clark Kent Sr. So, as one might imagine, Clark Kent Sr. is less than thrilled with this situation. One of our players back then, by the way, was Dave Eckelberger, who sadly is no longer with us. Dave was my best friend, and he loved situations like this because he thought the same old was insanely boring. Also, Dave's job was he owned a computer repair place. So just as he would physically take things apart and repair them, something that a mutual friend of ours pointed out at Dave's funeral was that he did that through gaming with societal norms too. He loved situations that asked questions about morality and ethics. He wanted to take culture apart and examine things that we believe. Then, at the conclusion, maybe improve things from their previous state of understanding. So, when one character would say a thing was morally wrong, Dave would ask why that was. And in the case of Superman, Dave actually suggested that while the pre crisis Superman did grow up in Smallville, raised by the Kents, and they for sure would have had early 20th century rural values and beliefs, Dave suggested that Superman spent time in the 30th century as a kid, and 1,000 years worth of changes to society would have happened by then. So ideas we have now, like consensual polyamory, were probably old fashioned ideas to the Legion of Superheroes. And at the very least, Superman has had endless adventures in outer space. He travels from world to world in much the same way that the crew of the USS Enterprise does, encountering new life and specifically new civilizations with completely new ideas about right and wrong. So Dave argued that a pre crisis Superman might not be as against this as everyone else thought he should be, which, of course, our players argued about. In the end, I ran Superman as being against it, but he was tempered with the fact that this was a wedding. It wasn't the time or place for a fist fight. So, that said, the wedding happened. And aside from the tensions that Superman Red caused with his new harem, things went well. The human father of Supergirl danced with her. The Kryptonian father of Superboy gave a speech. And several members of the superhero community were there, including Pulsar and Umbra. Speaking of marriage, Pulsar did something really odd back then. He built a robot duplicate of himself with all of his powers and abilities and left it on Earth. So the robot was married to his wife, raising the kids, etc. And Pulsar ditched him. He went off into space to have adventures and not be tied down to a family he didn't want, which we were all blown away by. Pulsar also started a war in space with a race of good cat people. So that was pretty messed up too. Umbra, meanwhile, had John Redbridge push some planets for him and make his own little solar system and started his own empire called the Imperium. He had clones taken from cat DNA to be the pilots of his new fleet with cat like reflexes, and he gave them starfighters shaped like a black crescent moon. He also cloned the Red Hulk and the Red She Hulk and called that race the Burathi. He had Hacker, a character played by John Boggs, create those clones. And then weirdly, the first time one rolled off the assembly line, Umbra nuked its heart with cosmic level lightning to test it, I guess. The poor thing died in one hit, and all the other clones flipped out, seeing one of their own kind get attacked. So Umbra killed all of them, all of batch one, and told Hacker to quote unquote fix this in future clones, which again, it was really weird. So, like I say, at this point in our timeline, things were really villainous. But hang in there. We're almost to the point where all of that turns around. Anyway, so I feel like this is a pretty good stopping point. Hopefully, you thought that this was interesting. If so, as always, we would love it if you chose to support the channel by smashing the like button, check to make sure you're still subscribed, because YouTube loves to unsubscribe you without telling you. And leave us a comment. We love hearing from you guys. That's it for me today. From everybody here at the longest running superhero role-playing game on Earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure. Bye.